see a little bit of Ankara. So we're going to start today with this session about ICANN, introducing ICANN, the ICANN multi-stakeholder model, ICANN structure, policy development process, how to get involved in ICANN. I'm joined with David Olive, Senior Vice President for Policy Development Support. David is going to cover the part related to policy development at ICANN and how the different constituencies of ICANN contribute to the policy development process. Again, our aim is to make this as interactive as possible, so feel free to raise your hand, ask any question at any point of time. I recall from yesterday that some of you had questions about ICANN, and we asked you to be patient with us till we have this session today. So now is the time to raise all your questions about ICANN. So before ICANN, the internet was not exactly the internet of today. It was far a smaller network of few computers located in some universities and research organizations, mainly in the US, and then it started during the 80s to connect to other places in Europe and other parts of the world. Probably up until the mid-80s, those computers connected to the network didn't have names. They only have addresses. So there was no DNS or domain name system back then. And those who used to use the network back then, they used to maintain a text file called hosts.txt that had all the addresses of the computers, so they know how to connect with each other. Now, as the network continued to grow, the engineers realized that this addressing system is not scalable, and they had to come up with a new protocol or a new standard for addresses for computers' addresses, and this was called the domain name system, whereby you have names and addresses, and names and translate to addresses, and vice versa. The very first domain name was registered in 1985, and that was about the same time when the DNS started to be used. And then between 1985 and 1998, the network continued to operate without ICANN. And as we heard from Milton yesterday, there were all aspects of trademark issues and intellectual property issues that led, the community back then to think of a model to sort of institutionalize the function of ICANN, and to establish an organization that coordinates the naming and addressing. As many of you know, that any computer connected to the internet today must have a unique address. Of course, this address could be absolutely unique, and it could also be unique to the network that it works within. So those who work in the network setup and network operations, they know that there are technologies such as NATing, whereby several computers on a network can share a small pool of IP addresses and go publicly through this pool. But in the end, the address that the computer can connect to the internet with at any point of time must be a unique address. And since the humans generally can remember and can memorize names, more than numbers, it's much easier to give computers or devices in general names like .com names, .edu names, and so forth, and then people can easily find the places they want to go to using those names. One of the famous analogies in this space is to compare the addressing system of the internet with the postal address. When you send a letter, you put an address on the envelope of that letter, and then the postal office is responsible for making sure that the letter will be delivered from the source to the destination, and of course the postal office does not have to look into the content of the letter. And this is more or less the ICANN function. The coordination of the DNS, the whole objective of this coordination is to ensure that the letters or the messages or the packets are delivered to the final destination, and of course ICANN does not look into the content of those packets or those messages. So basically, ICANN mission is to coordinate at the global level the domain name system or the addressing system, and we in achieving this mission, we do 5 key functions. We coordinate the allocation of the names at the root level or the top level. These are names like com, net, org, etc. So we do allocate those names to the TLD or top level domain registries. And yesterday we talked a little bit about the new GTLD program, for example, the new generic top level domain program with the introduction of 1,000 plus top level domains. So our role in this part is to allocate those top level domains to the registries and to ensure that domains are inserted into the root and that they work as they are supposed to work. The second thing that ICANN does is to the development of policies around those names, and this is the part that David is taking care of, and he's going to talk to that in more detail. The third part is to also facilitate coordination among root server operators. So the main database of those names and numbers, we call it the root system or the root zone file or the root database, and this root database is run by 12 different organizations. ICANN is one of them. We run one of the root servers, the L root, and then there are 11 other organizations that take care of the operation of the other root servers. So one key function that ICANN does is to coordinate the work among those operators or those organizations that run the root servers. The fourth function is to coordinate the allocation and assignment of IP addresses, and we do that through coordination with the regional internet registries, the RIRs, like RIPE NCC for Europe, Middle East, like AFRINIC for Africa, APNIC for Asia Pacific, ARIN for North America, and LACNIC for Latin America and the Caribbean. And the fifth function that we do is to provide registries with the to provide those who develop standards, technologies, applications, services on the internet, to provide them with the protocol parameters. Any service or any protocol or any application that runs on the internet must have a protocol parameter. This is again a unique identifier that ICANN or the IANA, which is part of ICANN as we're going to see in a few minutes, maintains through an agreement with the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, and we allocate those parameters to those who develop protocols and standards. So this is in a nutshell the ICANN mission and the key functions that ICANN does. So how do we do that? We do that through coordination with our partners, both from the technical community as well as from the global community. So within the technical community, we have organizations like the RIRs, IETF, the standardization bodies. We have stakeholder groups like registries and registrars who manage and run DNS infrastructure. But also we have other non-technical and maybe non-DNS sort of, stakeholders from all kind of, stakeholders, whether from business like ISPs, who also run infrastructures and run DNS infrastructure, and they also need IP addresses to be able to run their network and so forth. Business stakeholders, those who are in the internet business or any kind of business that rely on the internet, like e-commerce, e-banking, and so forth. All these businesses, they rely 100% on the availability and the stability of the internet to be able to deliver their services. We have partners from the governments and the international governmental organizations like UN bodies like WIPO, ITU, WTO. All these organizations do have elements in their work, in their processes that might have something to do with DNS and domain names. The very straightforward example here is the WIPO, for example. WIPO is the intellectual property organization of the UN, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and because of the very direct relationship between domain names and intellectual property rights, so there is a lot of interactions that we usually have with WIPO, for example. Other organizations like civil society groups. Yesterday we talked a little bit about civil society. We heard from Adam on the kind of civil society organizations that engage with ICANN. There were questions afterwards about ICANN's role in issues like human rights and so forth. So again, civil society and academia is one key stakeholder group that we interact with, and they are part of our sort of bigger ecosystem. Of course, the Internet Society is another partner of ICANN, the IETF, research and academic networks. We do a lot of capacity building work with those networks, and the IGF, Internet Governance Forum, whether the global one or national and regional one. And of course, the list can go on. Now, focusing more on the ICANN ecosystem, so there are three main components in ICANN. There is ICANN, the community, and this is the biggest part of the ecosystem. These are tens of thousands of individuals and organizations that are interested in ICANN and in ICANN's work, and these are the people that participate in the policy development work of ICANN and in other activities that ICANN does. There is the ICANN board. ICANN board is like any board of directors in any organizations. This is the decision-making body within ICANN. And then there is ICANN organization. This is the staff like myself, like David, Adam, Fahad. Currently we have over 350 staff in ICANN, and we are responsible for implementing the policies that are developed by the community. And we're going to speak to each of those components in more detail. So the community, the model, as we heard yesterday, is multi-stakeholder, involving all kind of stakeholders in an open and bottom-up manner. Policies get developed through the bottom-up participation and engagement of the various constituencies within ICANN. We have different constituencies and working group within ICANN, from groups that look after policies for generic top-level domains. Other groups look after policies for country code top-level domains. Other groups are responsible for policies for the IP addresses. And then there are some advisory committees as well, like the at-large advisory committee. This is the committee that represents end users, like the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. This is a technical sort of committee that advises the board of directors on issues related to security and stability of the DNS. There is the root server advisory committee. This is the stakeholder group that have representatives from all root server operators. There is the government advisory committee, or the GAC. This is a group that has representation from over 140 governments, plus maybe 20 or 30 plus international intergovernmental organizations. So all these groups and constituencies, they come together and work again in an open, inclusive and multi-stakeholder manner to develop policies to inform the rest of the community and the board on those policies, and to provide advice to the board on the various elements and aspects of those policies. So this is in very briefly how the policy is being developed. And again, David is going to explain this in more detail. But in a nutshell, if there is an idea for a new policy to be developed coming from one of those constituencies, whether the generic names or the country codes or the IP numbers, this group has to initiate the process by providing an issue report defining what the issue exactly is, and this report is basically posted for the public community, and for seeking feedback from the public community. Once this feedback is received and taken into consideration, the policy development process starts off with a call for forming a working group from volunteers to work on this, and then the working group starts drafting the first edition of the policy development, which also goes into the cycle of having a first version and then posting it for public comments, and then the comments are reviewed, and then a second version of the same document is being provided, and so forth, until the final document is ready to be presented to the ICANN board. The ICANN board of directors looks into the document, looks into the feedback coming from the community. The board might go back to the working group asking for clarification, asking for more work to be done, and so forth. Once the work is concluded and the board is ready to make its final call or vote on this particular policy, and assuming that the policy is adopted by the ICANN board, the board then directs staff to implement this policy. Please.
Yesterday, someone mentioned what happens if a policy conflicts with somebody else's view. And here's a case where to go to the board, there is a detailed report. What were the stakeholders consulted? What did they say? What were their views? And the board might say, oh, wait a minute, there's a contradiction between what the advisory committee said and what the policy is proposing. And the board would then likely say, I'm sorry, you'll have to go back and work that out. And this was the case what I was mentioning about the international domain name confusion tests, that they said, let's make sure that we get the right consensus so that everyone can agree on that. So there's an example of how that can go to the board, and the board would say, it's not ready for a decision. We need more work.
Thank you, David. So this is the first part of the ICANN community, is the one part of the ICANN ecosystem. The second part of the board, the board of directors, as I mentioned, is the decision-making body within ICANN. The board also provides strategic oversight for the ICANN, ensuring that the organization acts according to its mission that is stated clearly in the bylaws, and it, in accordance with the bylaws, the ICANN board also approves community policy and then directs, staff to implement those policies. There was a question yesterday about the composition of the board. How's the board being? How is it structured? So the board basically has 20 members. Let's go through this. So we have 6 members of the board, 2 of which representing or coming from one of the ICANN supporting organizations. So we have 2 members from the address supporting organization, or the ASO, 2 members from the country code supporting organizations, the CCNSO, and 2 members from the GNSO, or the generic name supporting organization. And the way those board members are being nominated to the board is through the an internal sort of election process within each of the supporting organizations. So each organization has its internal process to nominate and elect members to sit on the ICANN board. We then have and those 6 members are voting members on the ICANN board. We also have 1 voting member representing the at-large advisory committee. So again, the at-large advisory committee has its internal process for nominating and electing 1 representative to sit on the ICANN board as a voting member. So these are 7 voting members. And then we have 8 members, voting members, selected by what we call the NOM-COM. This is the nominating committee. These are, this is an independent committee of about 20 or 20 plus members, and we're going to talk about the NOM-COM in a second. But the main role of this committee is to bring more expertise to the ICANN board through an open public process of selecting members from the public community to the ICANN board. So every year the NOM-COM would have an open call for those who are interested in serving on the ICANN board or on one of the councils of the supporting organizations like the GNSO, CCNSO, etc. So those who are interested and can fulfill certain criteria, they can submit their applications, and then the NOM-COM has a process of looking into those, sort of vetting the applications, interviewing the candidates, and making the final selection on those candidates. So there are 8 seats on the ICANN board for voting members coming through the NOM-COM process. So we have, as I said, 6 from each of the supporting organizations, 1 from the ALAC, this is 7, plus 8 from the NOM-COM, this makes it 15. And then we have the ICANN CEO is the 16th voting member on the ICANN board. So we have 16 voting members on the board, and then we have maybe 4 or 5, I think 4 non-voting members. Those non-voting members come from the Government Advisory Committee, the Security and Stability Advisory Committee, SSAC, the Root Server Advisory Committee, the RSAC, and the IETF. So the IETF, as the technical body responsible for the development of internet standards, also has a technical, sort of technical liaison sitting on the board as a non-voting member. So this makes the composition of the board 20 members representing different stakeholder groups and coming through different processes, both from inside ICANN through the different supporting organizations and advisory committees, and also through a public process, which is the NOMCOM. Before getting into the NOMCOM, are there any questions or comments? Sogand, please.
I have one question.
Sure.
More than one question.
Sure.
Okay, first I saw in the slide number 17, you mentioned that there's a research network community for ICANN working with other organizations. You see research and academic. I want to know about it more. What type of network it is and what are you mentioning exactly?
Right.
Thank you. This is my first question, and then I have some questions about the board of ICANN. I want to know, is there any diversity regarding to nationalities and gender? And also, I want to know how many years they would sit on their positions, and also, what do the non-voting members exactly handle in the board? Thank you.
Sure. Okay, I'll take the first question first. The research and academic networks, they do participate in ICANN through different means. The at-large community is one community where there is a strong presence from the academic and research community. Another community or constituency, for example, is the non-commercial user constituency within the GNSO, and yesterday we heard from Adam and Milton Miller about NCUC, and Milton Miller himself as an academic, he was heavily involved in the foundation of NCUC. So academics, they participate in different also the country code supporting organizations. Some of the CCTLDs around the world, they are run, actually including here in Turkey, they are run by sort of research and academic networks or universities. So there are different places within ICANN where academics and researchers do participate. Some are interested in policy aspects, some are interested in more technical aspects, and so forth. At the from the engagement point of view, we do engage with many research and academic networks as well. We do a lot of capacity building activities with those communities. Here in the Middle East, we have established relationships with almost every research and academic network in the region. We go to universities and do outreach. We do capacity building workshops, whether on DNS or internet governance issues. We have some engagement initiatives with academic networks, like in Tunisia, for example. We have one with Khawarizmi Network, which is the research and academic network in Tunisia, and so forth. So this is the kind of involvement and work we do with this community. To your second question on the ICANN board, and David, I might need your help here as well. So there are actually some sort of guidelines or specifications, if you will, about the composition and ensuring geographical diversity. So it's written in the bylaws, the ICANN bylaws, for example, that within the composition of any board of directors, we cannot have more than 5 board members coming from the same geographical region. So ICANN has 5 geographical regions: North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific. So at any point of time, there cannot be more than 5 board members from the same geographical region. At the same time, there must be at least 1 member from each geographical region, at least 1 member at any point of time. On the term of the board of directors, the term is normally 3 years. At least this is the case with those elected through the NOMCOM or through the supporting organization and advisory committees. The non-voting members may have a different rule in terms of the term of their service, but at least for the elected members, the term is 3 years, and it could be renewed again depending on the process. If it is a NOMCOM process, then the board member, if he or she wishes to run for another term, they will have to go through the NOMCOM again, and it's up to the NOMCOM to either select them or not. And the maximum number of consecutive terms is 3. So any board member cannot serve more than 3 consecutive terms.
Means 9 years.
9 years. This is the maximum, David.
Yes, in terms of the members of the board appointed by the supporting organizations or advisory committees, that's an election process. And so the board just accepts that. Now, to balance that off, the nominating committee, of course, provides some other members of the board, the 8 that you mentioned, and this is where they look at gender and other skill set diversities for that purpose. Again, with the realization that you have to have regions, the 5 regions representative, not from more than dominating one region or another, and to do that. Now, in terms of those election processes, even the supporting organizations have that in mind now to do that. But as I say, the term limit is 3 times, so that would be the 9-year maximum for representatives from the supporting organizations.
Thank you. Just one more question. I want to know how much authority the board has to reject a suggested policy by the community. They can reject anything they like?
The system is based on consensus, and ideally what that means is that if the policy is gone through the process, the steps, and there is a consensus that it be adopted, there is great pressure on the board to do that. So in essence, in the ideal world, they want consensus policies, and they agree to that. Obviously, there has to be some balancing of the board. They have to worry about financial concerns. They have to worry about the liability of the processes, and they have to look at these various checks. So, if a policy goes through that says all ICANN organizations are tax-free, they'll say, well, that's not within our powers to do that. We cannot do that. And so to that extent, there are some other guidelines as the board of directors that they must do. But by and large, if there's a unanimous consent by the group proposing a policy, that's great pressure to accept that, because that's what's going to be the guidelines that people have agreed upon.
Omar, you had a question. Can you pass the mic on to...
Good morning. I will revert back to the question asked by my colleague. Part of it was not answered, the role of the non-voting members in the ICANN.
Right.
And I may rephrase the question. Why there are non-voting members in ICANN? What is their role?
Right.
This is the first question. The second question is, you mentioned that ICANN is running one of the root servers. So ICANN is one of the 11 of the operators of the 11 root servers. Would you just mention, for the sake of curiosity, the other operators as well?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So on the non-voting members, so the non-voting members, they represent their advisory committees, and their role is the role of the advisory committee in general is to provide advice to the board on the specific area of expertise of this advisory committee. So, for example, the Security and Stability Advisory Committee provides advice to the board on all issues related to security and stability of the DNS. The RSAC also provides advice on the root server aspects, any aspects in relation to the operation of the root servers. The Government Advisory Committee and the chair of the Government Advisory Committee sits on the ICANN board to provide the point of view and the advice that comes from the Government Advisory Committee. As we heard yesterday, those advisory committees, they work by consensus, and they come up with certain recommendations, like the GAC. The GAC has its communique. The SSAC, for example, they issue SSAC document. They have a name of those. They call them security. I don't know. They provide some technical documents on specific issues. They give them numbers. Those documents include recommendations and advice to the board on those issues. So this is to the question on the role of the non-voting members.
And so those same, since the advisory committees provide their opinion or advice to the board, members of the board who are not voting then provide and explain why they're doing this. What is the reason for that? So it's an ability to provide input at the board level, and also to report back from the board level to the various groups the deliberations of the board. So it's a representative role, but they cannot vote.
Adam, you want to add something?
Yeah, just to go ahead with that very quickly, the non-voting members play a full role in the board, except they don't vote. For example, they can be members of board committees, subcommittees. They can chair those committees. For example, the board governance committee is chaired by I'll go on anyway. So they play a full and active role within the board itself. So they just don't vote on matters of procedural votes.
We'll go to the second question. Is your comment on the same question? Okay, go ahead. We'll come to the next question.
I understood, right?
Right.
So the root server advisory committee and the security and stability advisory committee do it on behalf of the IETF.
Do what, sorry?
I missed that, sorry.
The security and stability advisory committee and the root server system advisory committee do the recommendation because they are voting member on behalf of the IETF regard the technical
No, it's not
policy.
On behalf of the IETF. So the IETF has its own liaison to the board.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the RSAC and the SSAC, they do their work as independent committees of experts in this particular area, whether the security and stability of the DNS or the operation of the root servers.
Oh.
Of course, there is coordination among all these technical
Yes, I
groups.
mean
There is,
yes,
of course,
yes,
there is this coordination, of course.
Okay. Thanks.
So the other question that Omar had was about root server operators. Yes, ICANN runs one of the root servers, the root L. Other root server operators include, I'm not going to mention all of them, I cannot, okay, thank you. VeriSign runs two of the, I'm sorry? Cheating, no. VeriSign runs two of the servers, RIPE NCC runs one of them. University of Southern California runs root B. Cogent, Paul Vixie runs root C. University of Maryland, root D. NASA, root E. Internet System Consortium, root F. Okay, go ahead.
So I'll be covering it actually.
You'll be covering it. So in a nutshell, there are 12 different organizations running 13 root servers. Out of the 12 organizations, there are 9 in the US, 2 in Europe, and 1 in Japan. And the key point here is that those 13 root servers have over, I don't know, 600 replicas or instances all over the world. So in Turkey, there are mirrors of root servers here in Turkey. In Egypt, for example, we have at least 3 or 4 of them. In many parts of the world, you would have, you know, mirrors of those root servers. Thank you. Thank you. Question.
I'm confused. Is it 15 or 16 members?
You mean 16 voting
The
members?
voting members?
16 voting members.
Okay. Usually on the committees we used to have odd number, not even number, in order to make the decision easier, because the majority is almost secure. But within 16 members, I think it's almost 50% can be reached. So if there's 8 against 8, what's the decision, final decision? This is the first question. The other one, that I cannot see that the Middle East or the Arabic homeland is represented in the regions. It's just 5 regions, and maybe we consider on Africa or Asia, while we have a specific conditions. Can we have a region represented in the board? I mean, these rules can be changed or not? Thank you.
Okay, on the second question, the regions, as I said, ICANN has 5 regions. Middle East and adjoining countries actually falls within 2 regions of ICANN, part of it in Asia Pacific, and part of it is in Africa, the North African countries. Actually, in the ICANN board, currently on the ICANN board, we have 2 members from North Africa, one from Tunisia and one from Egypt. So the region is represented, even though the region is considered as a sub-region of the main ICANN region, similar to Caribbean, similar to, you know, Southeast Asia. So there are 5 main regions, and the whole issue of regions, just for your info, ICANN did not invent those regions. We simply went with the UN definition of geographical regions, and since the UN has defined 5 geographical regions, we followed the same, you know, model. But then in our engagement work, we have many sub-regions. We have teams that look after the Middle East, teams that look after the Caribbean, teams that look after, you know, the eastern part of Europe, and so forth. Okay, so this is on the second question. On the first question about the odd and even number, David, you.
Generally, again, similar to how we operate on consensus, the board wouldn't, they would, my experience to date has not been a tie, if that's the case. Usually they will wait, and they'll wait to see if there's a compromise so that there is a majority approval. Sometimes the CEO does not vote, depending on the procedure. Sometimes it's operational, it's a budget or something like that. Those are day-to-day operations. Sometimes he will not vote, and that gives it the right mix. But I haven't, in my experience, and I sit on all the board meetings, that has never come up, because if they take straw votes, what's the feeling? And if they see that there is not an understanding, then they'll say we have to study it more, or we have to send it back.
And the rules is taken by the majority, not by say, full compromisation?
No, it would be it's a vote, so it would be a majority.
Okay, let's carry on. The NOMCOM structure, as I said, the NOMCOM is an independent committee, and it includes members from the different parts of ICANN. Like there is a member from the Address Supporting Organization, another member from the CCNSO, the Country Code Supporting Organization, 7 members from the GNSO, because the GNSO has several constituencies, whether contracted parties, non-commercial, and so forth. So there is 1 member of each of those sub-groups. And then there are 5 members from the at-large, again, 1 from each region: Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and North America. All these are voting members, plus 1 voting member coming from the IETF. And then we have non-voting members from the GAC, from the RSAC and SSAC. And then the chair of the NOMCOM is not a voting member. There is also a chair-elect and associate chair, and these are also non-voting members. So in total, I think we have 15 voting members and 6 non-voting members on the NOMCOM. So this is the structure of the nominating committee that selects 8 members to the ICANN board, and also other members to serve on the councils of the other supporting organizations. Okay, the third part of the ICANN ecosystem is the organization. Staff, again, as I said, staff is responsible for implementing policies developed by the community. The ICANN organization is also committed to being accountable, transparent, inclusive, and open for all. Currently, we have offices in different cities around the world. We have the ICANN headquarters in Los Angeles in the US. We have regional offices in Istanbul, in Brussels, in Singapore, and then we have engagement centers in Geneva, in Beijing, in Nairobi, in Montevideo, in Washington, D.C., and we also have sort of partnership centers, and these are partnerships that ICANN has had with organizations. For example, in this region, in the Middle East, we have a partnership with the Telecom Regulatory Authority of Egypt, and we established together what we call the DNS Entrepreneurship Center. So this is a kind of partnership that we have in the region, and there are similar partnerships in Paraguay and in South Korea. Our staff work from over 40 countries across the world, and here is some of the what the organization does. Of course, the DNS is the core function of ICANN, so a great deal of our work has to do with contracts and engagement with contracted parties from registries and registrars. We have over 1,000 registries and maybe another 1,000 registrars, so this is one of the key functions of ICANN, and with this function also we have a compliance function to ensure that those contracted parties, they are complying with the contract. Policy development support is another key component of ICANN, another key function of ICANN, and again David is going to cover this in a second. Operating the L route is another example of what we do. The engagement work of ICANN and ensuring that ICANN is engaging with all communities around the world, and the communities are getting more and becoming more actively involved in ICANN. This is the function of the department I work for, the Global Stakeholder Engagement Department. And then there are some more technical functions that ICANN does in relation to the assignment of the IP addresses with the RIRs, or the protocol parameters with the IETF, or maintaining the root zone and coordinating with the root zone operators. And these 3 functions, we call them the IANA function. Okay, and I'm sure that many of you have heard about the IANA function. So the IANA function is something that ICANN inherited from Jean Postel when ICANN was established in 1998, because before that date, Jean Postel used to run the IANA function. And actually the IANA function, even though the term itself was not very popular back then, but the function itself existed since 1972. This is the time when some of the technical folks around the ARPANET back then started to manage the technical resources, okay? And then the function had evolved over time, and Jean Postel started to be the sort of the trustee or the operator of this function for over maybe 20 years, until ICANN was established in 1998. Very quickly, the way ICANN work on distributing IP addresses, it happens through the coordination with the RIRs, the 5 RIRs covering the 5 regions of the world. So there is a global policy for assigning IP address blocks to the RIRs, and this is decided by the Address Supporting Organization of ICANN, or the ASO. And then each RIR has its own policy for distributing this resource within the geographical region the RIR is responsible for. And as I said, this is part of the IANA function. As you know, the IANA functions or the IANA function was transitioned from the oversight component of the IANA function was transitioned from the U.S. government, the U.S. Department of Commerce, to the global multi-stakeholder community after 2 years of deliberations within the ICANN community, and the IANA contract that was due September 30th last year, 2016, was concluded, and it was not renewed, meaning that the stewardship role of the Department of Commerce of the U.S. government has come to an end, and currently the IANA function continues to be run completely by ICANN, yet the oversight role of this function is transferred to a newly established organization called PTI, which is established as a subsidiary of ICANN, yet it has its own board of directors that oversees the organization. So this was a key development, and the reason I'm mentioning this here is the transition of the IANA function was a key development in the history of the internet, and also in the it shows that the multi-stakeholder model works, because this transition is a product of the multi-stakeholder model, and without the multi-stakeholder model, the community couldn't have reached consensus around what model to be in place after the transition. So happy to take more questions now before handing the floor over to, well, we're going to take a break in 30 minutes or 25 minutes, so we can carry on, and then, yeah. Can we pass on the mic to Hussam?
My question is, I have two questions actually. I have a question of when the non-com representative in the board of ICANN. I was a little bit confused, since I saw the structure is 21 member, and there is like 4 member from non-com in ICANN board. And my second question is about the DNS Entrepreneurship Center, which partnership with in Egypt.
Right. Okay. So on the first question, the board, it's 20 members in total, 16 voting members and 4 non-voting members. Of the 16 voting members, 8 members come through the NOMCOM. Does that answer the question? Or
No, there's 8 non-com representatives.
right.
But how they are chosen from the 21 structure?
Yeah. So they're actually selected through the NOMCOM process. Okay. So we have the NOMCOM process whereby, you know, there is a public announcement. The NOMCOM would announce that, well, this year there is going to be 2 seats vacant on the ICANN board. Those who are interested and, you know, meet this criteria, they can apply, and then the process goes on until the final selection is done by the NOMCOM, and you get the NOMCOM members. I'm not sure whether, again, this answers the question. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, so
David, do you get the question? Sorry.
I chaired it, so I can.
Yes, you know.
Sure.
Yes, yeah.
You were the chair of the committee.
Right. So the nominating committee begins really as a sort of recruitment committee.
He's talking about the composition of the NOMCOM itself.
Or something like that. And
they put out an open call saying, we have these vacancies on the ICANN board or the at-large, and they take out and they go and recruit a big pool of candidates. And so that will be 100 people qualified to be directors. And then the nominating committee sort of switches from this recruitment role, building the pool of candidates, and then it starts selecting who are the good ones, willowing them down till they get an, you know, and then at the end of the day they select. This year it will be 2 new members for the ICANN board, and then those 2 people that they select will join the board for that 3-year period. So that's what the nominating committee does, and it refreshes that every year. So this year I think it was 2, next year it will be 3, and next year it will be 3. So over a 3-year period they add 8 people. Did my maths get right? 3, yeah, it did. So over an 8-year period they will, a 3-year period, they will add 8 people to the board, you know, right. But yeah, basically it begins by recruiting, calling for names, good people, and then it selects from that pool of candidates and adds the best, or the people they select, to the board. Yeah, the nominating committee is the selection committee, essentially. That's their job. It's to find candidates and then make the selections, and they go to the board.
And to your second question, I'm sorry, go ahead. I was going to ask the question.
The other way of thinking about it is an executive recruiting company. But unlike an executive search committee, they have criteria they have to fulfill, regional and diversity and things like this. But that's like any other company would say, I want you to find me a CEO, here's what we're looking for. And that's basically what they do.
And very quickly to your second question about the Entrepreneurship Center. So the main objective of this center is to develop capacities in areas pertaining to DNS, not only in the Middle East, but also in Africa. So the center does conduct capacity building workshops. We do support these activities as ICANN, and one of the programs that, you know, sort of the center is helping with is to train people who can become trainers themselves, like train the trainer kind of program, to have more technical DNS technical trainers in the region. And I'll be happy to speak to you in more detail about the center. So now I want to turn it back to David to walk us through the policy development part.
So I think at this stage, I know it's coming to the end of a heavy information session for you, but again, you must want to think of, when you think of the multi-stakeholder model that we're talking about at ICANN, think of it as a new form of rulemaking or guidance that differs from a traditional governmental, regulatory, or law-making approach. Think of, in a government, if they make a regulation or a law, under closed doors, they come up with their experts, they give you a 100-page document of law, and they say, this is what's going to happen in a month, good luck. And what happens there? Well, you know, governments have the power of law, and they can do that. But whether or not it can be complied with, whether or not there's cooperation, there's always that kind of tension about that. So the multi-stakeholder approach of consensus really links to our history of the networks working with each other, involving those who are users to be part of a process. And so the multi-stakeholder process is involving those who want to be interested, who have an interest in how the system works, to have an input. And to that extent, it is a different model from an expert governmental approach to lawmaking or rulemaking. The difference is, of course, that at the end of the process, people who've been involved in input and have a consensus, they know what's going to happen. And so they're not surprised by a law being passed, or they're not surprised by compliance, because they're preparing for them, because they know the people who register domain names, people who use domain names, have commented about what's easier, what's not, what's problem solving in that sense for the rules and the procedures to be followed in the domain name system. So think of it in those terms. The other point is that, oh, well, who else uses this kind of consensus approach of stakeholders? In many ways, you know, some governments would say that that's not very efficient. No, we don't, in a criminal justice system, go to the prisons when there are some convicted criminals and say, what do you think, should we change the rules? No, in some of those areas, that's national security, military, that's a different approach. But in areas where you need cooperation of many of the stakeholders, or many of your populations, this consensus approach is very helpful. We see it in the Environmental Protection Agency, Environmental Protection area. A government can pass a law, tomorrow you will not pollute. The next day, is there no pollution in the air or no pollution in the water? Why is that? Well, we need the cooperation of industry not to spill things into the lakes or the rivers. We need people to be careful. We need other conservation methods. You need the multi-stakeholders to come and tell you what would work, what we'd like to have happen. And governments are realizing that that's a very helpful way if you want to have good laws that people comply with. So there are slowly but surely kind of examples of this. If we think of technical, for those engineers and technical people, the standard making process. Well, there's the official, lengthy, sometimes 10-year that the International Telecommunications used to do to make a standard. And then businesses and industries said we should have something more flexible. Let's kind of agree to a standard that we'll license so that it helps promote a technology or promote a use. This is, again, kind of a consensus approach to things. And so to that extent, ICANN follows that relatively new model, if you will, still tested. And that's the concept I want to have you think about as our governance model is this involving all the stakeholders who are affected, who want to input, and to make sure that the consensus policy is the best solution for the job. In terms of course, you have to structure this a bit, and to that extent, we have 3 supporting organizations doing global policies, and 4 advisory committees who comment on and provide their specific expertise to the policymaking process so that we have the best possible solution and all the technical and procedural and legal, in terms of governmental advisory committee, aspects involved. And so it works that way. Here are the groups as you see them. The address supporting organization for the numbers side of our work. The country code name supporting organization for the global policies for the country code operators. And the generic name supporting organization for the generic or global, as I call them, global domain names. In that sense, those are the places where policy begins and are developed, and they go through various processes, and I'll explain that later, before it ever gets to the board for any final resolution. Obviously, the advisory committees on the other side provide their expertise and they comment on and make sure that the policies being developed are correct within national laws from the government's point of view and within technical parameters from the technical society. So here we see they form councils. Those are somewhat of the guiding bodies of their policy development process, and they are represented regionally within the regional internet registries. Just so that you know, the regional internet registries, and you'll hear this more this afternoon, they make their own policies for the region. They only come together at ICANN for global policies, such things as IPv4 allocation, IPv6 addresses. These are the various global policies that affect all of the regions, and they have a rather interesting system for making that global policy. But in the meantime, at the local level, they manage their own policies for the distribution of the numbers, the Internet Protocol numbers. Obviously, the country code operators form this council that directs their global policies. Again, at the local level, the national registries make their policies. So .tr makes its own policies for how they register, how much they charge, the various elements of that. Only when it comes to a global level of the allocation or reallocation of operators and whatnot do they come together at that level. And then, of course, the Generic Names Association again runs their policy development process for the generic names. Okay, to that extent, we talked about the Address Supporting Council, and these are the various members. The interesting thing about how they make global policy is all 5 of them must agree to the same text before it becomes a global policy, and so that's somewhat their consensus point of view. It takes a while. They don't have many of them, but that is the tradition that they had even before ICANN, and it's one that continues to this day. Again, with the country code operators, most of that is done at the local level with the registries, and they come together for their global policies and also to interact with other members of ICANN, because they are registries, they have registrars, they have people using their country codes, and it's those experiences that people want to know about and hear about, and they interact obviously with other members of the community and provide their expertise and commentary on some of the policies that are developed in the generic name supporting organization. This is really the main group, because unlike some of the others where policies are developed locally, these are all developed at the global level, and therefore the various stakeholders are involved with this. These are the users and or suppliers of the registrations. So the registrars and registries obviously register domain names. The business users, the intellectual property community, the internet service providers are all in somewhat providing or using these names, and they provide their interest into this. The thing to remember here is we talk about the structure of how to channel the views or opinions of various groups into the process. This is the way. It's rather diverse, but this way we can get the advice of those who run registries and registrars, what's practical, what works, what doesn't work. Others who say it's very confusing to us, how can we register names, why is it so expensive? All these views come into play in looking at procedures and practices. I should give a good example, and particularly in this area. I was talking to some of you about registrar transfers. This was a policy that was developed really basically because of complaints of registrants. They would register their domain name with company A, and they had a wonderful website and they were doing business on it, let's say, or exchanging information, and they didn't like the service that the company was providing. or they were charging too high a price for their services, so they wanted to move to company B. But, you know, I'm David.com, I want to be David.com to the world, and if I move to another registry, I don't want to change that name. How can I change that? Now, in the telephone world, you know of it as number portability. You can keep your same telephone number, 123, Turkcell or Turk Telecom or whatever company keeps the same name, and so that you have that, and it's easier for you. Same thing happened with the registrars, and the registrants said, I don't want to lose the name, I don't want to go through another procedure, I just want to keep my David.com and move it to company B. It's cheaper, it's easier, and the like. And so they did a policy process to do that. And so if you look at that, people kind of commented, the users of that, the business constituencies, the non-commercial users said, this is a good idea. This helps the customer, if you will. It helps the registrant. It makes it simpler. The registrars and registries said, well, okay, if we have a process so we know that, we can transfer things so there's no disruption of service. And even the Governmental Advisory Committee would say, well, there's no law against that, but it's a good consumer protection practice. We like that idea. And so that's how that became a policy. But again, it was, again, part of the demand of the community to change a system that was initially developed as we thought it would work. And so we have this kind of registrar transfer or domain name portability concept. So it makes it easier for the registrant and easier for the general public to access David.com no matter what host is doing it or what operating company is taking care of it. So to that extent, that's the structure to start policies. And usually, as we talked about in the process, any of the advisory committees can suggest policies. And here we go to the advisory committees. So any of the four advisory committees can say to the supporting organizations, we think you should look at a policy or develop something or address an issue or address a problem. And those supporting organizations then come up with an issues report that says what is the issue here, what are the factors involved, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and then the governing bodies say, yes, I think that's a problem we have to solve. Let's move forward on that. They create a working group. We do all our work at ICANN on volunteer working groups to come up with solutions. This is the problem-solving nature. And they put that through various steps that engage the formal structures of ICANN, all these stakeholders and constituencies, as well as the general public in public comments. And so to that extent, that's an important part of the policy development process. In terms of advice, that's done in somewhat of a different way, depending upon the organization. And so with the at-large, this is a very active group and one that is more at the local level than some of the other groups possibly, because they have a structure for trying to engage the regional groupings as well as the local at-large structures to comment on the policies, or at least inform them of what policy is being developed. And they do this in a mechanism that lets people know what's happening as well as asking for their advice, and they formalize that advice in form of a document that they send in either to the board or to the public comments saying that our at-large community has looked at this and here is their view in an official way. In terms of the Governmental Advisory Committee, their role is to make sure that the national law, if you will, or public policy, international laws, are respected, and that the policies or procedures we develop at ICANN do not contradict national or international laws. Many of the technical areas would not. Registry transfers would not necessarily conflict with any law, but it does coincide with good practices of consumer protection and reliability. Another example I mentioned to some of you was the notion of having escrow, data escrow, protecting the database of registrars and registries, so that if something happened to one, earthquake destroyed the company, the servers, the company went out of business, that the websites registered would not be lost, and they would be able to come back on service rather quickly. This is again another protection mechanism that the technical experts in the network days all knew very well about, and we wanted to make sure that that was extended to the services we provide to our community. And so to that extent, you know, the Government Advisory Committee would say, well, there's no law that says you must do that. Some countries may, some countries may not. But it's good practice to protect the data and make sure the service continues. When it comes to the more technical side, the root server system, the advisory systems, and the security and stability advisory committees, here are the most technical parts of our community. And they're looking at what policy changes might affect the operation of the root servers. Will it disrupt them? Will it be a problem? And in particular, though they don't always comment on every policy being proposed because it may not have an impact, they look at them. And in particular, with the expansion of the top-level domains, going from a few registries to now over 1,000, there was a big question of whether or not the root server system could accommodate such a large expansion in the use. And so they were asked that question. Would it break the system? And they did a study, and they wanted to make sure that the system was reliable enough and robust enough that it would not. Similarly, with the Security Stability Advisory Committees, these are experts in networks, cybersecurity, and the like, and they look at policies from the view of, could this cause a problem for attacks, denial of service attacks, or could it create an issue of instability? Here was the case where, when I was talking to you earlier about the internationalized domain names, in terms of confusing some texts, Latin versus other languages, that could cause a problem or a stability problem in matching the unique name to the materials of the website. And so they were putting out the fact that we have to be very careful about that to avoid such problems that may destabilize the system or confuse the users or the system itself. That is that a Cyrillic P or a Latin P in a name, for example. We have all sorts of things. This is kind of the short version of the various steps, and it's very important to have these steps, and I'll explain those in a minute. The board asks this question of the policy team that I had, of any proposal going to the board: have you followed the procedures? And this is very, very important. Who has been consulted? What did they say? Who is in favor? Who's not in favor? And to understand fully that we have consulted the communities and others and have gotten the views of the groups as they wish to provide them. And this is very important. It's important in the generic naming side, because how we then have policies applied across the world is we put them into the contracts of the registrars and the registries. And contract law, as we were mentioning before, was the vehicle to internationalize and create an equal treatment, the same service across the board for all the registries and registrars. Thus, the community has that same body of service, and if the policies are not being observed, then we have contractual compliance to say that you're not following the policy and there are some consequences. So it's an enforcement mechanism indeed. And to do that, they agree that if the policy is followed by the steps, then they will add it to their contract as a contractual compliance requirement of their work. And so that is the mechanisms that are important to follow the process, that of course so people can look at it, see what steps, who was consulted, what was said. Public comments are open to everyone. And you can see and track the various proposals that were looked at, rejected maybe because of being impractical or not having a consensus, and seeing the final product to the board that says this is what the recommendations are, supported by the community. And so to that extent, we go through, there's a lot of things which we can share with you later. To that extent, that is how the process works. The organizations are always looking for volunteers to be on working groups and for inputs by individuals or organizations. And to that extent, I think I'll stop and let you ask questions, or we can ask further questions at the break. I'll stop.
You. I'm not sure if you have explained it or not, maybe I have missed it, but I want to know about 21 GNSO parties, more the difference between contracted and non-contracted parties, and what's the idea behind having two types of parties. Thanks.
Let's see if I can.
It's in 29, number 29.
So again, here was the question of how to involve all the stakeholders. And the contracted parties are those registrars and registries that have operating contracts, if you will, with ICANN. The whole the notion here is that to change their contracts, they have to be a party. They're also a party of this process. And so it was to provide those kind of focused structure of those who provide the service of registering domain names, and those more on the user side, those who are using the service, in kind of to hear both views. And so part of it is to have a balancing of power, as Milton Mueller was talking about, between those who have contractual obligations and those who are looking for ways to change or modify how the registrars and the registries do their business. And so it's a balancing of interests and procedures. And so part of it is to say, well, what if someone said, you should make things free? They would say, well, that doesn't help our model. We can't do that. I'm not sure we want to do that. Or some procedures may be indeed not practical. And so in the discussion of what is the solution that should be involved, there are those who have a daily operation of registering domain names could say, well, we can't do it that way, but how about this way? This is a solution that could streamline our procedures. And so it's part of that give and take of what are the interests and how to balance those interests that we had those two parties. In some, think of parliaments, you have an upper house and a lower house. It's something similar to that.
How long does it take since the very beginning of a policy suggestion till it gets accepted by the board? Because I feel it takes a lot of time to go through all these committees. And I would also appreciate if you can tell us like an example of a policy that was accepted or rejected by the board and the steps it has been through, if it's possible, I don't know. Thank you.
A very good question. In general, the consensus, people say that the consensus process takes more time because you have to sort out and have compromises and the like. In general, it takes about 1 year from the start of a policy to the final approval of the board, depending on how technical or how complicated the issue is. People said, well, okay, fine, how does that compare with some other groups? It's kind of hard to do that, but if you think about national laws, sometimes it takes several years. In the United States, it took 10 years to change the Telecommunications Act, as we were talking about, from the regulatory to the deregulatory approach. That took 10 years before the US Congress could approve that. When looking at other groups, technical groups, and even some of the IETF, they could be sometimes 1,000 days, they say. It depends on the technical side of things. But the point is that we have this roughly 1 year. Sometimes it takes a year and a half, sometimes 2. And on the larger issues, for example, the expansion of the new top-level domains, it took more than that. Again, that's a big enterprise, a big activity, and that needed more time for people to understand and approve and move it forward. An example of start to finish, I should do that. Oh, here, thank you. Here is the kind of the general scheme of how that works. Again, roughly that would be about 1 year in the generic name supporting organization. In the less frequent versions of the address supporting organization, that may take them maybe 2 years to get this consensus from all the regions or more. For the CCTLDs, the country code operators, that's about a year and a half to 2 process, depending on the complexity. So what we see in many of the areas where there are technical issues, the working groups will break it apart and go step by step to make sure that they can address the easier questions and then move to the harder questions to make sure that there's progress being made. The other point to make, there is a feedback loop, a review mechanism process that it kind of says, has the policy been successful? And mostly it's usually through complaints of the contractual compliance, or comments through our call centers, that we get feedback, as well as from the advisory committees and the at-large groups that say it's not working or it should be changed and modified. And so that goes back again to the various groups that have made the policy for modifications. And we see this a lot as well, that if they see that something is not working, they will try to make sure that there's a fix.
I know we need to break. I just included a few slides at the end about how to get involved in ICANN. I know that some of you have already been involved in ICANN. Some of you have come to ICANN through the fellowship program. Some have taken part in some of the activities we do at the regional level, like the regional strategy working group and so forth. But here are some pointers to where you can sort of start. Of course, attending the ICANN meeting is one way of getting involved, but it's not the only way. All ICANN meeting and ICANN meeting sessions are sort of, you know, live streamed online, so you can follow and you can actually participate remotely in all the sessions. The website, ICANN website, also has lots of information about the different ICANN processes. We also have a platform called ICANN Learn. This is an online education platform where you can enroll in online courses on different topics. You can check it out through learn.icann.org. We do organize regional activities, regional events like DNS forums, like this program on Internet Governance School. Programs to help you get more engaged. The fellowship program is one. This is a program that brings around 50 participants to each and every ICANN meeting, and ICANN would fund travel and accommodation of those participants. The ICANN Next Gen, this is targeting students within the age bracket of 18 to 30, whether undergrad or postgrad students. And the main objective of this program is to sort of build the next generation ICANN community, those who will be developing policies at ICANN 10 years from now or 15 years from now. We also have a program for newcomers, those who come to ICANN meetings for the first time. We kind of, offer them with mentoring to help them, participate, effectively in the meeting. This is the ICANN Learn platform. You can check it online. ICANN meetings. These are some statistics about the ICANN public meetings. The next ICANN meeting is going to be in Abu Dhabi, end of October this year. So it's taking place in this part of the world. So it's an opportunity to see more participation from the Middle East at ICANN. The next meeting will be in Puerto Rico in March 2018. Again, you can find more information about those meetings online. Again, we're happy to take any questions now, during the break, or during the week. Yeah, go ahead, one question.
I have a question regarding financial part of the ICANN. So whenever we buy a domain, how much part of that, what percentage of that goes for ICANN, and what is ICANN doing with that? Beside that, it is paying the salary to its staff and other things, and beside that, they are paying for the programs like ICANN Fellowship, NextGen, and all. And plus, are they taking part in the financial and in the money that we are individually buying the domain, or only they are taking the money when they buy the whole domain? For example, .web was sold out in the bidding. I wanted to know a little bit about this.
Okay. So when anyone registers a generic or a domain under a generic top-level domain like a com domain or net domain, you pay an amount, whether it's $10, $20, to the registrar, the company that you register with. And ICANN charges the registrar 18 cents, 18 US cents per domain. So this is one source of revenue that comes to ICANN. Registries and registrars, the companies that are in the business of domain names, they also pay contributions to ICANN on yearly basis based on their contracts with ICANN, based on the volume of the size of the portfolio they have. So this makes the budget of ICANN, and then ICANN has a process to engage community in setting our budget for, say, the next fiscal year. So our fiscal year starts on July 1st. So like 6 months before the time of the start of the fiscal year, ICANN starts the planning for the next fiscal year and the budget planning process. And we do engage community in this. So we publish the first draft of the budget of the next year for public comments. We normally, during the ICANN meeting that takes place in March timeframe, we have a public session to discuss the budget. So there is a whole process of engaging community and then getting final approval of the ICANN board on the budget, including what and where ICANN is going to spend the money. And the money normally goes to the ICANN public meetings, the different activities that ICANN does at global, regional level, various functions at ICANN, from legal, compliance, registries, registrars, and so forth. You mentioned something about .web. And I'm not sure I get the question right, but my understanding is that you're referring to the money that ICANN receives from auctions or from those, yeah. So the amounts that have so far been received through what we call the auction proceeds, these amounts so far are kept in a separate bank account Okay, so it's not part of the ICANN budget, and there has been a discussion within ICANN community about how ICANN is going to spend this money. And recently, and as we heard yesterday from David, there was a new cross-community working group established to look into actually it's not looking into the question of how ICANN is going to spend the money. It's looking into the question about what are the mechanisms that ICANN is going to establish in order to, you know, spend the money in the right, you know, channels or right areas. So the cross-community working group has recently been formed, and it's going to work on the, you know, the mechanisms that ICANN can establish to find, you know, means to spend the money that comes from the auction proceeds. David.
It's a very good question to say, well, what are we getting for our money? And to that extent, we are designed to be a nonprofit organization, not like a company. And so the ICANN meetings we do not charge. The support of the various organizations, the 4 supporting organizations and all their members, the 3 supporting organizations, excuse me, and the 4 advisory committees and all their mechanisms and meetings, they don't pay for. We service all that. We provide that service to them as a way to run the system effectively and efficiently. But you have to have money to run the system. And so the budget is designed to pay for that, plus the technical infrastructure behind that. Running of the links to the various organizations and the technology behind that. In addition to the root servers run their own, of course, but we have our own systems to make sure that there are technical studies, and that's all shared with the various groups. So that's the money that is spent in those areas and publicly available on our budget.
Just one.
That is just waiting that we need to end the session. Okay, one more question. Can we take a question from Susan? One last question.
It's about financing again. We know that CCTLD registries do not have to pay annual fees to ICANN, and although they may like to pay voluntarily, and this can be perceived as unfair by other registries. Is there any complaints about this, or is ICANN planning to force CCTLD registries to pay regularly? We know that in the past they tried, but they failed. But thank you.
Susan, thank you very much. That is correct. In terms of the fees we were talking about, that's only for the generic names or the global names, the registrars and registries there. We don't have a similar structure for the country code operators. Again, the thought was let them make their voluntary contributions if they want to, say they want to contribute. And some do, and some don't, but there's not a requirement that they do so. And they still get the same service, and they all benefit from the IANA service, which is making sure that everything is correct and technically right and things like that. That's, again, a free service to them and to all the others that use the domain name system.
Yeah, I think we need to end the session now. We have 10 minutes to break, and then we'll have to come back at 11 sharp, because the next speaker of the next session is going to be remote. So Fahad, you may want to give us some